How are you guys doing? Today is Monday, January 4th, 2021, out here in this quarantine. I'm James Sims, and for this episode of The Elite, I'm going to do an individual profile on one of the best running backs probably in NFL history. And with his last game of 2017, he was able to eclipse 2,000 yards for the first time in his career. And by that running back, I am talking about Derrick Henry, the starting running back for the Tennessee Titans, who today turns 27. And because that's the way I'm doing my elite profiles, I'm doing everything that is on paper that is officially record as of right now, because there are still awards that are up for grabs that he might win between now and the end of the season. But as of right now, I'm just going to go through where Derrick Henry is with his career at this very moment. If you're unfamiliar with Derrick Henry, he is probably one of the greatest high school prospects that ever came out of Yulee, Florida. In Jacksonville, there was even a rule when he played in high school that when his team went up by a certain amount of points, they had to sit him. That's how dominant he was. After high school, after being named Florida's Mr. Football, and he was named a high school All-American. He was recruited to go play at Alabama with Nick Saban, and he didn't really get he wouldn't really get a lot of his carries until he was at least a sophomore. Definitely not until he was a junior, because when he was a sophomore, he was behind. Or when he was a sophomore, he had a couple running backs ahead of him. But when he was a junior, and for the 2015 season at Alabama, he was able to run for 2,219 yards while running for 28 touchdowns, which would help him get the Heisman, one of the best college running back seasons that anybody has ever seen. He was a unanimous All-American, first-team SEC Offensive Player of the Year, Doak Walker Award, Maxwell Award, and Alabama happened to win the college football championship that year. So, of course, big win for Alabama as they beat Clemson that year. And Derrick Henry, after having won the Heisman, probably at the best individual year that a running back could have in the NFL. Then he went, or I guess he was good enough in college to get drafted. He was drafted in the second round. He was the 45th pick overall in the 2016 NFL draft, drafted to the Tennessee Titans. And initially in his rookie season, he was placed behind DeMarco Murray for his initial season. So for 2016, he would only start 2 games, but he would play 15 games in a season where the Tennessee Titans would finish with a 9-7 record, which they got the same record for 4 seasons in a row, but that's the worst season that they've ever had or that's the worst record that the Tennessee Titans have had since Derrick Henry's been drafted there, which is pretty impressive considering he's never had a losing record in the league and he's now 5 years in. And this season, he would finish with 490 yards, 5 touchdowns on the ground. He also had 137 yards through the air. Not that big of a season. Like I said, he was playing behind DeMarco Murray, who I think a couple seasons prior had led the entire league in rushing yards, so it would make sense why Tennessee would do that. But in 2017, they decided to give him a tad more carries. In 2017, he would start 2 games and play all 16 in a season where the Tennessee Titans would make the playoffs after finishing second in the AFC South. They would beat the Chiefs in the very first round, and that was when Mariota was the quarterback. And then they would lose to the Patriots in the divisional round when Mike Mularkey was the coach for his second full year being on the team. In this season, Derrick Henry would finish with 744 yards on the ground. Still, he had 5 touchdowns as well. He also had a receiving touchdown for the first time this year, as he was still kind of building himself up. This was the last season that he didn't start at least half the games. Jumping into 2018 in his age 24 season, the running back finished with 1,059 yards, starting 12 games in playing 16 in a season where the Tennessee Titans have finished 9-7 for the third year in a row since he's been there. This time they wouldn't make the playoffs, so they finished 3rd in the South, and it just wasn't that good of a year for them. But of course, they were still working their way up there. Like I said, he finished with 1,059 yards, 12 rushing touchdowns. He had double-digit touchdowns for the first time ever in his career. He had a 99-yard touchdown, which is his longest touchdown to date, and which is tied with Tony Dorsett for the longest rushing touchdown in NFL history. Through the air, he also had 99 receiving yards, giving him a total of 1,158 yards from scrimmage, the first time he'd ever eclipsed 1,000 yards in an NFL season, and the first time he'd had double-digit rushing touchdowns, or just touchdowns in general in a season. And then 2015, I think, is where his career has 2019 was where his career took off, and I think is still continuing to take off. In 2019, he would start 15 games in a season where the Tennessee Titans would finish with a 9-7 record. They would finish second in the AFC South for the fourth year in a row since he'd gotten there. They'd make it to the wild card, and they'd beat the Patriots in the first round, 20-13. Derrick Henry bulldozed over the entire New England Patriots defense. Then they used the same strategy at Baltimore against the Ravens, their second straight road game. They would end up beating the Ravens 28-12 using Derrick Henry just running over the Ravens defense. Speaking of which, they play the Ravens. He plays the Ravens this upcoming weekend in the wild card. But going on, and they also lost to the Kansas City Chiefs, who would go on to win the Super Bowl. They lost 35-24 in a surprisingly close game, considering Derrick Henry, in addition to Ryan Tannehill, but Derrick Henry was their main offensive weapon for the Tennessee Titans for that entire season. But in that season, for the regular season, Derrick Henry would lead the league in rushing attempts. He had 303 carries for a league high 1,540 rushing yards and a league high 16 touchdowns. So of course, he had the rushing triple crown for the season, averaging 102 yards per game over 15 games, which is very impressive. And then adding his receiving yards through the air, I mean, he had 206 of them, the most receiving yards you'd ever have in a season, and he had 2 receiving touchdowns, which would give him, at that point, a career high 1,746 yards from scrimmage, 18 all-purpose touchdowns in 15 games. Of course, an amazing season for an amazing running back. And then 2020, I would argue, was an even better year, for at least regular season-wise, because the playoffs haven't started yet. He would start all 16 games for the first time in his career in a season where the Tennessee Titans would finish 11-5, they finished winning the AFC South. And their first wild card matchup will be against the Ravens on, I believe, Sunday. Don't take my word. Well, it's either Saturday or Sunday. It's one of the games. But it'll be another opportunity for Derrick Henry to show how dominant of a player he's been for the entirety of the season for the Tennessee Titans. And this season, just coming off the season that ended yesterday, he would finish the season with a league-high 378 carries, which is the most he'd have in his career by 75, and he still led the league in carries. He led the league with 2,027 rushing yards, the first time in his career he'd ever eclipsed 2,000 yards. He's the 8th player in NFL history to do so. He led the league with 17 rushing touchdowns, so he had the league rushing triple crown for the second year in a row as he averaged 126.7 yards per carry in 16 games. Receiving, he'd finish with 114 yards, so in total he'd lead the league in touches for the first time in his career with 397 touches. He'd finish with 2,141 yards from scrimmage. And he finished second in all-purpose touchdowns to Alvin Kamara, who had one more touchdown than he did. But with this, he was named to his second straight Pro Bowl. And in 2019, he was named to the second-team All-Pro. I imagine this year is going to be named to the first-team All-Pro. As it's really rare to be a member of the 2,000-yard club, and that's what he's a member of as of right now. This is where his career currently sits. If you've ever seen Derrick Henry, he is 6'3", 250 pounds. Ever since he's been playing in Florida, he's been the size of a defensive end or a linebacker, and he's just a very smart player. He's takes care of his body incredibly well. I would argue he's probably he's the LeBron James of the NFL in terms of how much different his body is than other players. And he's just been a player where he's going to run it every single time, and he still finds a way to get big runs in the NFL, which is to show that if he's too big for NFL linebackers and NFL defensive ends to tackle, then he's a serious problem in the NFL. And considering he's just turning 27 now, in the middle or at the end of his second straight of his rise to possibly a Hall of Fame career, Derrick Henry is an amazing football player, and going into 2021, especially into the playoff game this weekend, and looking forward to the 2021 regular season, Derrick Henry is definitely a player I'm going to be watching. Look out for NFL's Unstoppable Force, number 22 for the Tennessee Titans. And with that said, if you ever, I'm just going through this, Derrick Henry is an amazing player. Happy 27th birthday to him. And hopefully he puts together a good amount of, a lot more elite seasons in the NFL. Because as of right now, January 4th, 1994, Derrick Henry's 27th birthday. Derrick Henry is an elite athlete. With that said, I want to thank you once again for listening to all 10 and a half minutes, 11 minutes of this piece. I hope all is well, and peace out. I'll come back to you after this with another player profile, but I'll catch you after. Peace out.